Have you ever heard the urban legend Frostbite before? I grew up in the rural Canadian mountains, and I'm not sure how known it is. I was adopted at an early age, and my adopted mother, Rosemary, used to tell me about the beast that lived at the top of the highest mountain here. She said it lives at the top because that's the coldest area and likes the lowest temperature possible. In the winter, as the weather gets colder, it supposedly travels down the mountain in search of food. No one has ever seen the beast and lived to describe its appearance. However, bodies have been found in the snow, partially devoured. The species of the beast remains a mystery. The bite marks don't appear to be any animal native to our region. Rosemary seems to enjoy scaring me by telling me that Frostbite is coming to find me and eat me. The only way I ever made her smile was when I was terrified. Every winter, I would have to check the thermostat before going outside and playing. We lived at a ski lodge, and the only fun activity to do was going out, skiing by myself. There were no kids of my own age living nearby. In retrospect, the isolation probably made Rosemary a little crazy too. Going outside was a good way to avoid her. My adoptive father, Chris, wasn't any help against her. In fact, they both treated me like the help, and never let me forget that I'm only their adopted child, not blood-related. Chris was a wealthy, retired ski champion. They believed because they adopted me from the less fortunate circumstances, I should be grateful. As I got older, I began to resent them both. As a teenager, my fear of frostbite faded. I started to stay out skiing later and got pretty good at it. The problem with skiing down the mountain was that it's a long walk back uphill with my skis in hand. On my way home, this especially cold evening, frostbite crossed my mind again. The darker it got, the more I began to regret my decision of being out so late. Suddenly, a bright light shined toward me from behind. I quickly turned to see a jeep driving towards me. I sighed in relief. The driver rolled down the window and asked me if I knew Chris. I explained he's my adoptive father, and the man offered me a lift to the lodge, before putting my ski equipment with his on top of the jeep. It had been a while since I spoke to anyone aside from Chris and Rosemary, so I tried to strike up a friendship. The man's name was Tom, said he was a former colleague of Chris's. He looked to be in his 30s, and Chris was about 60 at the time of retirement several years prior. It was a little odd. His radio was on, and even though the signal was terrible, I could hear parts of the local weather report. It said it was getting especially cold that evening. All I could think of was about frostbite, and how lucky I was that Tom was taking me back home. Back at the lodge, Rosemary was standing on the front porch, smoking a cigarette as the jeep pulled up. I asked Tom to wait in the car for a few minutes as I explained the situation to Rosemary. Like I said, she had become a little crazy, and I didn't want her to lash out in front of Tom. I apologized to her for being late. She smirked and told me she saw the thermostat. I knew what that meant. I explained who Tom was, and that he was here to see Chris. Rosemary walked over to the jeep and invited Tom inside. I stayed behind to untie my ski equipment, and then followed them into the lodge. Chris was delighted to see Tom, and I overheard them reminiscing about ski races they had both competed in. As I walked into the living room, Tom was admiring the many medals and trophies Chris had displayed around the room. Chris told me to make them all drinks, which I did. This gave me a chance to further eavesdrop on their conversations. It turns out Tom was a current ski champion that never got the chance to compete with Chris. Chris retired around the same time Tom started to compete. As I brought them their drinks, I distinctly remembered Tom saying, "Do you know I'm a world champion now? Like I said, I really have no contemporary in the sport." he continued. I'm not suggesting you risk your legacy at your current age, but off the books, I'm challenging you. Any mountain you like. Let the best man win. Chris replied, It's lonely at the top, huh? As he looked at the highest mountain through one of the lodge windows. This was the only mountain Chris was hesitant to ski on, due to it being very steep and dangerous. I never dared to either. Rosemary told me that the mountaintop is the coldest area of the region, meaning it's likely where Frostbite lives. If you believe the legend, that is. Nobody has ever skied down it successfully, Chris explained. But if anyone could, it would be us. I look at that mountain every day. It torments me. Tom replied, If that's the mountain you choose, let's do it. Rosemary interrupted by asking, Is this a bet? What would my husband even stand to gain if he makes it down alive and beats you? Chris explained this wasn't about money, only reputation and the love of the sport. Despite her objections, they toasted to the upcoming race and offered Tom the guest room for the night, which he accepted. The race happened the following morning. I watched them leave in the Jeep from my bedroom window. No goodbyes. That was the last Rosemary and I saw either of the men alive. Several years pass, and I was now in my 20s, still living at the lodge with Rosemary. She still treated me as her servant, but due to her smoking, she had become ill of health. Honestly, I was glad. It wouldn't be long until she passed away, and I would inherit the lodge and my parents' wealth. It's what kept me going through all of her mistreatment. One day, as she was coughing her lungs out, she lamented to me how she wished for closure about Chris before she died. When he disappeared, a search party was organized but called off very quickly. Like I said, the mountain is very dangerous. Searching it all was unrealistic, even for two public figures. Aside from the Jeep, no trace of them was ever found. Rosemary wanted to find their bodies. I suggested that only experienced skiers have a chance of making it all the way down the slope. I've watched you ski, Rosemary said. What's stopping you from going down there yourself? That was the closest thing to a compliment I've ever got from her. I stuttered before managing to get out one word. Frostbite. She turned away from me in disgust. Later, I noticed her staring out of the same window Chris did, contemplating. She told me to find 3 professional skiers in the area and invite them to the lodge, which I reluctantly did. It was refreshing to have visitors at the lodge. They weren't exactly champions, but they were the best I could find. The first 2 to arrive were young men, Roger and Kenny, and they just seemed happy to be getting a free ski trip and accommodation. The final skier, Amelia, arrived and was drop-dead gorgeous. She looked like Rosemary did in photos of her younger days, before I was born. Amelia assumed I was hired help and threw her luggage at me. I wasn't even annoyed. A woman as beautiful as her could mistreat me as much as she likes. You can probably tell I didn't get to see many women whilst living in the mountains. I became immediately drawn to Amelia at first sight. While escorting her into the lodge, I then remembered what was in store for her. She recognized Chris's photos on the wall and said she's a fan of his. Whatever happened to him? She asked. As I hesitated to explain, the other 2 skiers introduced themselves to her. Good timing. I discreetly went to Rosemary's bedroom and told her all of her guests had now arrived. I summoned up the courage to ask her, Are you going to tell them about Frostbite? She scolded me for even bringing that up. As we walked towards the living room, I noticed the thermostat. Again, it was one of the coldest days of the year. I had a horrible feeling about Rosemary's scheme, but at this point, I was in too deep to prevent it. Rosemary quickly changed her demeanor as she introduced herself. I'd never seen her so gracious. She explained that Chris was elderly and mentally unwell when he got lost in the mountain, This was definitely bending the truth, but it put any trepidation the guests had about the mountain at ease. The first skier to make it down the mountain wins the lodge when she dies. I was lost for words. All these years I served her, and she offers my rightful inheritance to strangers. What next? Rosemary offers an additional cash prize of 50 grand to anyone who finds her husband and can prove it. I struggled to maintain my composure. Amelia bluntly asked, "How can we prove we found him? We can't exactly carry an entire body down the mountain." Rosemary replied, "His wedding ring will do." She then directs her guests to a table with an assortment of tracking devices and body cams that I bought for them. The body cam to prove they skied down the mountain, and the tracking device in case they get stuck on the mountain, for whatever reason. All 3 skiers accepted the challenge. The next morning, I watched Roger, Amelia, and Kenny drive away towards the mountain. Rosemary turned on the TV monitor. The screen was divided into quarters, so we could watch all 3 body cams at the same time, with the bottom right corner being left blank. "Get me a glass of brandy, will you?" she demanded. Overcome with anger, I snapped at her. "I'm your son. How can you give away all of my inheritance?" I expected her to hit me for my disobedience, but this time she didn't. She said, "This race includes you. You want the money in the lodge Chris worked all his life for? Do what he did. Go earn it." After giving it some thought and looking at the thermostat, I couldn't. I didn't have the nerve. Rosemary laughed at me. "You better hope none of those skiers make it back here alive." I sat and watched the events unfold with her. I was keeping an eye out for any sign of frostbite. Roger was the first to be eliminated. He went off of a cliff, landed on a boulder, and stopped moving. The impact sounded like bones breaking. I wanted to call the police, but Rosemary wouldn't allow it. She seemed amused by the situation. Kenny was in the lead until he fell into a tree and stopped moving. Amelia was the most cautious, and we watched her look around for anywhere Chris could be. Distracted, she slipped and began rolling down the slope. I was horrified. Not her. She was wailing in pain and had broken her skis. She dragged herself into a nearby cave. There she discovered the partial remains of a corpse. As Amelia got closer, Rosemary and I made out that it was Tom. His frozen face was intact, but little else. Something had been eating him. "It's Frostbite! Frostbite ate him!" I exclaimed. Amelia realized this wasn't Chris and carried on through the cave. It was then she found Chris, frozen in the ice, eating Tom's flesh from the bone. It was then I realized Frostbite wasn't a beast. It was people. People in the mountains who were desperate and had to eat each other to survive a little longer. Amelia proclaimed, "I found him, but I can't make it back by myself. Someone come and get me, please." She was right. Injured and without skis, there was no way she'd make it back here by herself. I picked up a body cam, tracking device locator, and my ski equipment and packed it into my family car. As I drove away, Rosemary continued to drink and watch the monitor. All 4 quarters now functioning. As I went down the mountain, I saw the remains of Roger. His head was crushed and his brain was splattered across the boulder. It was a horrifying sight. Next, I skied towards Kenny, who was impaled by a tree below. His intestines were wrapped around the top of the tree like they were Christmas decorations. At this point, I was becoming desensitized by all the gore I had seen that day. I was thinking about Rosemary watching my body cam footage, and the sick pleasure she was probably getting from all of this. My locator directed me to the cave, and I greeted Amelia. She looked in bad shape and didn't move much.
"You saved me," she said.
I was proud of myself, and I hoped Rosemary was a little proud of me too, watching from home. Amelia said,
"One problem. I couldn't find Chris's ring. I looked everywhere. Is it possible he didn't bring it with him?"
I wasn't sure, but I figured Rosemary had seen Chris through the body cams, so the ring wasn't necessary. More importantly, I realized in my haste I hadn't really planned how to get Amelia down the rest of the way of the mountain. Damn it. I made a makeshift sleigh with my skis and some of Chris and Tom's items and began to drag Amelia out of the cave. I had to move Amelia slowly so not to injure her further. It was far from ideal, but I figured Rosemary would call the authorities for help. We begged her to. Several days passed. I dragged for as long as I could each day. The hungrier and weaker I got, the more time I spent resting. We resorted to eating snow along the way. At this point, we were both starving and close to death. Amelia's face was now blue and zombie-like, and she said mine was too. We were getting close to the bottom and had to keep moving. The lodge was finally in sight, and I collapsed. I was unable to get up after dropping to my knees. "We're here, but I can't go on," I told Amelia. She untied herself from the sleigh and miraculously carried on walking without me. I was stunned. That bitch. She was walking with a limp, but she was in much better shape than I.
"I guess I recovered. I'll come back for you," she promised.
I didn't believe her, but I strangely admired the way she used me. I was falling in love with her. I suppose Amelia had won and inherited the lodge, but in the moment, I was only concerned with surviving. After resting for a short time, I managed to drag myself up and continue to the lodge. I was too close to let myself die out here. Every step was more painful than the last. As I got to the driveway, I began to smell food. It seemed Rosemary had cooked one of her famous roast dinners. Gravy, roast beef, stuffing. Was I hallucinating? I felt I was arriving at the gates of heaven. I opened the door and followed the smell into the kitchen. There was nothing but empty plates. Well, there was some dried gravy left over, which I immediately licked clean off of the plate. I then drank and ate what was left in the fridge, which was very little. I was still starving. Rosemary stepped into the doorway.
"Oh, you're back. I didn't prepare any food for the loser," she said.
Rosemary dropped Chris's wedding ring onto the counter.
"Amelia stashed it when you weren't looking. Rather amusing, isn't she? She's won the lodge and the cash prize."
In that moment, my anger for Rosemary hit a boiling point. It was beyond my control. I launched at her, falling down on top of her. She tried to scream, but her lung issues prevented it. I tore her throat out with my teeth and ate it. Honestly, it was delicious. I couldn't stop myself. I continued eating her flesh off of her bones until my hunger pains eased. Where is Amelia? I wondered. How would I explain this? Would she understand? I crept upstairs and found her sleeping in the guest room. She was breathing softly. I didn't wake her and crept back down. A mirror in the hallway caught my attention. My skin was blue. My eyes were bloodshot red and Rosemary's blood was dripping down my chin. I looked more like a beast than a man. I was staring into the face of Frostbite, terrified of what I had become. Suddenly I snapped out of it. Time to clean this mess up before Amelia wakes up. With no food left in the house, I decided to trim the remaining meat off of Rosemary with a carving knife. Waste not, want not. With just her skeletal remains left, I dragged her outside and buried her deep in the snow. The local authorities will chalk it up to another Frostbite killing. For good measure, I deleted all body cam footage of the ski race. No motive, as far as the authorities would be concerned. I left my mother. She left and I hadn't seen her since. These things happen. Finally, I mopped up the blood and cooked the rest of the meat myself. By that time it was morning and good timing for breakfast. Emilia came downstairs as I was preparing the meat. She was surprised but relieved of my presence.
Sorry I left you. I told Rosemary you were out there. Where is she anyway?
I explained that Rosemary left, and Amelia was now the benefactor of her estate. Her attitude immediately shifted and reminded me of Rosemary. She sat in the dining room, and I served her breakfast. Medium rare steak with gravy. As she took her first bite, I stood patiently waiting for her approval.
You can stay,
she said, satisfied with my cooking. I'm now living as her servant, and I'm the happiest